This meeting is for 1 hour and 30 minutes. Tim M. will be sharing on absolute surrender for 50 minutes, followed by a 20-minute Q&A. This is Tim's fourth time speaking at the Broken Elevator, and we are delighted to have him back with us. Tim, thank you for saying yes to God and to Alcoholics Anonymous. We appreciate you. Please help me give a warm welcome to Tim M. from London, UK. His home group is Brick Lane Big Book Study. Welcome, Tim.
Thank you. Good evening. Hello, everyone. My name is Tim. I'm an alcoholic. The reason I chose absolute surrender is it's the answer to my alcohol problem and it's the answer to everything else. And I've come to that conclusion having tried, well, as close to everything else as I could. Um, I'm not going to dwell on the alcohol side for the whole talk. In fact, I hope to dispense with it fairly swiftly because it's the easiest part. Um, when I got to AA in January 1993, I'd already surrendered to the idea that I cannot drink safely because whenever I drink so much. I'm just ill generally. I've never understood people that could hold down jobs in the same week that they're drinking. I just didn't understand how you could do that because I couldn't, the amount I was drinking, I couldn't get up at a normal time anymore. I couldn't function the next day, simply physiologically because of the quantity from the night before. I was never someone that could just shake it off. I got to AA. It was very clear that I should never drink. If I start, I can be off for months, if not years. Um, what I was clear about also, I'd surrendered to the idea that I was going to have to give up alcohol completely. If you have problems with alcohol and you can't moderate, if you don't want to die, you have to give it up completely. And I was clear I was going to have to give it up completely. A close relative of mine died directly because of his alcoholism, and uh, I knew where it was going. I knew where it was taking me. What I hadn't surrendered to was the idea that uh, I couldn't keep myself sober with just a little bit of AA to keep me company, meetings to go to, people to talk to, all of that business. I was still very much in charge throughout those first 6 months in AA. I was in AA for 6 months between the January or so and the July. My last drink was the 24th of July, 1993. Over those 6 months, I wanted to acquire the parts of the AA program which I thought would suit me. I wanted to acquire the people, extract from them everything I could, and shore myself up, bolster myself in my desire to stay sober. And the funny thing was, I remember the first meeting I went to, I got home and I tipped away all of the alcohol that was in my possession. I'd never thrown away an inch of gin in my life, but I threw away a whole bottle of gin down the sink, laughing as it gurgled away. I had no trouble staying sober that night. Very odd. I had no trouble staying sober the next night. And the condition I was in was this. Whenever I wanted to stay sober, I found myself perfectly able to stay sober. Except I had a second problem, which was my mind would keep changing. Not in response to distress or sometimes people talk about restlessness, irritability, and discontentment. Um, I sort of know what people mean, but if I'm truthful, the thought of a drink would occur to me when I wasn't irritable, when I was all right. I was just walking down the street, everything was fine. Uh, a thought of a drink might occur to me when I was happy. It's certainly not the case that a thought of a drink would occur to me only in one of those three conditions. Just untrue. And I don't think I've ever met an alcoholic for whom that is true, uh, that they only drank in those three conditions, and when they were happy, they could perfectly well stay away from alcohol. In fact, most people I know, long-term sobriety, who drank after many years, in almost every case, it's an innocuous situation. There's hardly anything going on. It's very because what I've noticed with friends of mine who get into terrible straits years sober, and it's been the case for me, you're so aware of how unhappy you are, you end up going back to meetings before you drink. Um, in the big book as well, their poster boy example of the alcoholic is Fred, pages 39 to 43, and they go to enormous lengths to point out this is not someone who is unhappy, restless, irritable, discontent, failing at life, terrible relationships, none of those. But he succumbs to the insane notion that a drink is a good idea. And that's the true nature of it. I think it's masked by the other stuff. But anyway, the point is, I'm getting way off track. The point is that in those 6 months, my mind would suddenly flip. It was as though I would suddenly flip and become someone who didn't want to be in AA, who just wanted to drink. And once I'd crossed over to the other side, I would drink. And all of the little tips that you had given me were quite useless because they'd been given to someone else. They'd been given to the sober me. And the wanting to drink me is not the person. I don't have access to those tips. I'm not interested in those tips. That's the whole point of this almost split personality. There were two me's inside me at once. The me that wanted to look after myself and the me that didn't give a hoot. When I become the wrong one doesn't care about what the right one wants. So all of the tips and tools available to the right one are irrelevant, which is why I never tell people if you feel like a drink, call me. Because if you feel like a drink, you won't. Um, and this alarming condition got my attention in July 1993, when yet again I had a slip on a day when I woke up wanting to be sober. Sometimes people have said, I've never heard of anyone who drank on the same day that they asked God for a sober day. I did. I did it regularly. I know many people who have. The program is not a magic wand that I wave by saying a single prayer in the morning, which then acts as an amulet or a talisman, which keeps me sober the whole day. Fundamental change is necessary. Once you've engaged on the program of fundamental change, the little prayer in the morning probably does a great deal, maybe for oneself. But it's not a box of magic tricks, this. So where does absolute surrender come in? It comes in here. The person I was constantly choosing between those two personalities, the bit of me that wanted to get well and the bit of me that absolutely didn't. Whilst I was doing the choosing, whilst I was in charge, I would drink again. The choice had to be taken out of my hands. One of the I think so many people have had a go at this line. I think people are frightened of saying it. But for years, people would say, today I have a choice. And then all the speakers and podiums would say, that's sort of whiffing, really. One doesn't have a choice. When I'm in a drinking mode, I have no choice. I'm going to drink. when I'm in the care and protection of God, I could no more drink alcohol than I could paraquat or throw myself out of a window. It's completely inconceivable. It's not an available option. Choice needs to be taken out of my hands. And surrender is it's not a very cheerful thing, I'm afraid. I could have chosen a cheerful topic like the joys of recovery. There are lots of people that talk about those. It's very, very nice. And they tell you what a big life they've got. And this is supposed to be a very, very good thing to have a big life. Um, I have a peaceful life. That's different than a big life. And in fact, a peaceful life is often associated with a relatively small life. You choose the things that you want. Anyway, again, I'm getting off the topic. What's the point? The point is that left to my own devices, if I'm given a choice in this matter, I will drink. So choice had to be taken out of my hands. It was like locking myself out of the sobriety room, and then, sorry, locking myself out of the drinking room and pushing the key under the door so that I could no longer get back in. That was the deal I had to make with AA. And I know we say one day at a time, but that's a description of how I live. I live one day at a time, and I might come to that as a topic later on. But the big book is very clear. One must be absolutely clear that there is no possibility of ever becoming a normal drinker. Or even if there were, there would be no way of testing whether one is in that fortunate camp. The only way to test out the theory would be to have a drink, and a single drink might literally be the end because it could start an unstoppable process. So, for all intents and purposes, I can never drink safely again, which means to, to surrender totally meant a surrender to the idea, the principle, I must never drink again. Now, I didn't have to swallow all of that all at once. I didn't have to mentally digest the future. That's a different question. But I had to be signed up to that proposition intellectually, to the idea. I couldn't have the sneaky idea in the back of my mind. Perhaps if I get my external life sorted out, and perhaps if I get a big life, then I can drink again. Because I was housing that idea for a little while in AA. And the logic of my mind goes like this. It says, well, if you might have a drink in the future anyway, you might as well bring it forward to today. So even those little tricks, put off the drink till tomorrow, put off the drink till later. I'm afraid it winds back to, well, what I'll do, I'll get it out of the way now, and then I'll come back to AA immediately after. That's what kept happening. I really had to face the idea. If I was going to survive, I was going to have to stay sober. And I didn't have to like it. I had to choose it. There is a difference. And I loved AA when I first joined. After 6 months in it, I didn't love it at all. I disliked people on all sorts of grounds. I found some people incoherent, others full of empty platitudes. Other people I found patronizing. Most people I frankly found boring. Um, I It's lovely the first few days, first few weeks, but after a while, the reality hits. The people in here are like the people out there. They're the same people. I liked a couple of people, and that was enough, a small handful of people, and that was fine by me. I didn't set great store by what recovery could do for me or what sobriety could do for me. But there was one thing which AA clearly did offer, which was of interest. And they said, you, Sonny Jim, need never drink again. And I thought, if I can go through life with the dignity of never again being arrested for being drunk and disorderly. That's enough. And I don't care. I wanted dignity far more than I wanted happiness. Um, Sometimes I think we do people a disservice by dangling the carrots of all of the wonderful things. Those things are wonderful. But I think one is a fool if one thinks there aren't going to be difficulties. And those difficulties, let's list why there are difficulties. Number one, there is a lot of mess to clear up. Number two, I did not know how to live, and learning to live was difficult and painful. Thirdly, there are all sorts of psychological doodahs which come up and bite you on the behind 5 years, 10 years, 15, 20 years sober. Things arise from the past which had been buried, maybe for good reason, maybe because one couldn't deal with them. And you get to a point you think, I can deal with this now, so we're going to deal with it. There are other addictions. Um, Illness. I've had very serious illness at various points in my recovery, or since I've been sober. People die. Things don't always go well. People's careers aren't always stellar. I heard a couple of recordings recently. Well, actually, a recording, and I heard someone speak, and I heard someone speak about when they were away and a family member was in hospital, and 78 people from AA came to visit their relative. And I thought, when I was 8 years sober, I was very ill. One person from AA came to visit me. A bunch of people from work came to visit me and stayed in touch, but the AA people didn't. There's a sugar-coated view of recovery and sobriety, which you will hear from the podiums. Sometimes it works out like that, but not always. This could be very tough, worth it, but tough. And to go into it with the idea that it's not going to be tough is setting oneself up for trouble. But I tell you, my drinking was so appalling in terms of the physical consequences, the psychological consequences, the emotional consequences, the social consequences, frankly, the sexual consequences, which I will spare you the lurid details of. But I got myself into all sorts of trouble. It was so bad. Sobriety is enough. At any given point, sobriety is enough. And this was the nature of my absolute surrender in 1993. I will do anything as long as AA keeps me sober. And I think AA collectively said, deal. And it's worked. Now, of course, the good news is that there have been many tremendous things. And I always don't like to list them uh, for lots of reasons, but let's name a few. I actually have interests. I have things that I enjoy doing, which don't involve dependence on another human being. I'm married. I've been with someone for 19 years and we get on very, very well. I have an occupation which pays the bills and has enabled me to comply with Tradition 7. So I'm fully self-supporting through my own contributions and with Concept 12, Warranty 2, which means I have 2 years of operating expenses at call if anything should go wrong. If I should fall ill, be unable to work, I'd be fined for 2 years before even having to think about asking anyone for money. Lots of very good things. I've known some wonderful people. Most of the wonderful people I've known have died. Some at their time, some before their time, but I knew them. And it was worth it for that, even though they're not here now. So it's absolutely worth it. But the surrender is not conditional on getting anything other than sobriety. My old sponsor, Brian, was very clear on this. He said during his drinking, everything went his way. His career was sensational, traveled all over the world, had amazing people in his life, lots of famous people of various domains. And he said, since he got sober, he's been sober 40 years now, I think. Very little has gone his way. He's got some good friends, though. Um, why did I trust this surrender? It's because I saw other people who surrendered and it worked. In particular, surrender not just in relation to alcohol, but in terms of the project of sorting the rest of one's life out. I remember uh, Doug, the sponsor I had in the early 90s. I went to a very gloomy meeting on a Monday in central London, and and everything looked as though it was grey washed. All the people looked as they were grey washed, and people were very down at heart. Doug wasn't. He'd come in sort of cheerful and showing very positively about the wonderful program. And people would look askance at him, and it was clear he didn't care. And I liked that. I liked the idea of being unaffected by other people's responses. And I remember many years later, I was sponsoring someone, and she said, "Do you want to know why I asked you to sponsor me?" And I said, "Go on." She said, "Well, you were sitting there in meetings in hoodies with holes in the hoodies, and you didn't care." And I thought, if I can leave the house and not care if there is a hole in my hoodie, then that would be a significant improvement in my life, as I care very much what people think about me and my appearance. So one doesn't have to show off to attract in AA. It it all happens under the radar, I think. Honestly, um, this is the reason why I mentioned a sort of couple of the very, very good things. Um, not to brag, almost to tick the box, but the truth is, the reason I went for it in AA is because I simply instinctively trusted some of the people. It wasn't because they sold it to me, something about their whole manner, about their whole deportment. I thought if I could live with an ounce of whatever they have, good enough for me, very good. I can live with that. If they can teach me how a little bit of what they know, very good. And I started to surrender the rest of my life. The following story will be horrifying to many people in their early days, or anyone under 35, I should think. When I was 9 months sober or so, I went on a date. Um, I know. Uh, I hadn't finished the steps, so I was utterly unreconstructed. I went on a date and I met someone, and things progressed very rapidly. I didn't see my own bed that night. And the next day, I was all churned up inside emotionally. And I phoned Maureen. I told her about the emotional churning. She said, "Have you got his number?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Tear it up while we're on the phone." And I did. And she said, "If he calls, don't pick up, don't return any message, don't see this person again." And I did what she said. I didn't ask her to explain it because it's very rare that a request for explanation is genuine. It's normally the start of an argument. Be very wary when someone asks you to explain anything. They understand it. They just don't like it. They're going to try and find a hole in the argument so they don't have to do it anyway. I didn't need it explaining. I knew instinctively she was right, and I trusted her. So I did what she said. I was told as well by Doug. I mentioned I found someone in one of the meetings rather fetching, and he said, going to use a bad word, "Don't shit where you eat, princess." So I didn't. Um, I did what I was told. I was told to do the steps. I didn't. I was told to make amends. I didn't. I was told to sponsor. I did. I was told to go to a ton of meetings. I went. I didn't argue. I didn't talk about it. I just did it. I don't think I even spent much time on the phone to either Maureen or Doug in the times. Doug sponsored me formally, Maureen a little bit informally. There were some phone, but it wasn't this experience of constantly recounting all my troubles and woes. I just got on with it. And as I got on with it, I took my troubles with a pinch of salt. I haven't unraveled what was wrong with me, and there was a lot wrong with me. Let me tell you, other than alcohol, um, uh, antisocial and mentally ill. That's the short version, but that gives you a picture, doesn't it? Uh, I didn't sort any of that out. I've been lifted above it, and it's gone away, and it hasn't come back. It is not by relentless psychological self-examination that I got well. I got well through action, spiritual action. I was in a meeting a while ago where someone said that in their view that it shouldn't be a moral inventory because that moral was a very old-fashioned word, and I think we were supposed to read from this: old-fashioned is bad and modern is good. Uh, she didn't explain why old-fashioned is bad and modern is good. I think it was simply understood. So morality is old-fashioned and psychology is modern. So it's very, very good. So it ought to be a psychological inventory. Now, I've tried to do psychological inventories. I get myself very, very tied up in knots. A moral inventory is disarmingly straightforward. You see, we didn't make up the inventory process. It came from outside AA. We may have takes on it, and certain sponsors uh, have their own way they take people through. Um, I take people through in a particular way. It's big book, but I'm very keen on looking at how one uses language and whether one is telling the truth or using language to conceal things. So we learn to tell the truth very simply. People want to make it very complicated, and I want to make it very simple. And the truth is always very simple. Do you want to know what my inventory ultimately was? Here's a little step 5 for you. So what my moral failings? It's very arrogant. Uh, what that meant was I thought if I believed something, it was true. And if you didn't think the same as me, you were stupid or dishonest or malevolent. Pick one. You must do what I say because I'm right. That's another aspect of arrogance. You must think very highly of me, even when I make the most horrendous mistakes. You must discount those. Um, Conceited about my abilities. Um, Being educated several notches beyond my intelligence didn't help. Vain, very concerned with my appearance, how I looked at other people, how much of a catch I was, how much of a prospect I was. Um, Mistrustful of people, mistrustful of the world, mistrustful of God, gloomy, cynical, self-pitying, extremely ambitious, not to achieve things of value, but to achieve things in order to look good. Desperate to have unfeasible amounts of security so that nothing can get me. No amount of money would be enough. No, no number of buffers would be sufficient to protect me against the world. And essentially uninterested in other people. That's a moral inventory. And as you can see, it doesn't take very long, does it? But it gives you a picture. Got a picture now, haven't you? Glad you asked me to speak. This is but this is the truth. And that inventory is not unusual. Everyone's got their own list. And there are some things which I think the one defect I have almost none of is jealousy. I'm very, very lucky there, but I've got pretty much everything else. And the marvelous thing about a moral inventory is there's nothing you can do with it. You can't fix it because those traits run through me like the words that run through a stick of rock. That's a British image. If you're American, you might have to look up what a stick of rock is. I don't know if you have it, but it's anyway. You can look it up in your copious free time. Those traits were my essence. They were my being. I mean, even listing those, I still hugely identify with that. With the psychological approach, I have the idea that if I understand myself well enough, I will fix it by virtue of my understanding. And it never worked. But it always gave the appearance of working. The funny thing about a moral inventory is there is absolutely nowhere to hide. It's utterly clear. I can do nothing about any of those. I cannot remove my own conceitedness. I cannot remove my own arrogance. It's very difficult to have your arrogance removed when you're right. You sort of, I mean, you can't. One's whole perception of the universe and one's place in it would have to change for one cell of that personality to shift. Um, my image is that God can move mountains, but even lifting one of those tiny things, imagine trying to pick up something on the ground and it turns out it weighs 15 tons. You have this in nightmares sometimes. You're trying to lift something up, but you can't even get it a millimeter off the ground. That's me trying to change me. Which is why in step 7, it says we ask God to remove our character defects. And sometimes people do very intensive work on 6 and 7, as though there was some terrible mistake when they wrote the big book and they just sort of forgot to write about 6 and 7. So now we've got books on 6 and 7. Very good, very interesting. I don't know how necessary they are to the step, but they're very, very interesting. In step 6, what I'm saying is I give up. I give up trying to change me. I give up trying to find a better way of looking at things. I cannot do it. And in step 7, I say, over to you, God. Now, it isn't the last step, so there are things for me to do. The removal of character defects. So understand what a character defect is. It could be a false belief, and I'll give an example presently. Or it could be an unhelpful thinking pattern. I'll give an example of one of those presently, or an unhelpful behavior pattern. An unhelpful belief would be that the purpose of my life lies in having a successful career. That's a false belief. There are people without successful careers who are quite happy, who are quite fulfilled, who achieve a purpose in life. There are people with successful careers that have not achieved any purpose in life. It's a false belief. In my book, it is. Maybe you got a different book. In my book, it's a false belief. An unhelpful thinking pattern, very straightforward. Worry. Worry doesn't help. It doesn't pay. If worry is trying to pay off a future debt of pain, it doesn't pay it down one bit. Doesn't help. And any form of worry and fretting and fussing and gloom. And an unhelpful behavior pattern. The whole arena of flirting, sexual acting out, promiscuity, for me, maybe other people can get away with it. I can't. These are my defects. They needn't be yours. Now, I'm asking God to remove these. And God says, right, well, you've got to go and make amends first. When you come back, having done that, I'm going to keep you very, very busy. I'm going to keep you very busy sponsoring people. I'm going to keep you very busy going to lots of meetings, sharing about Him, God. God's going to keep me very busy in the world. There's plenty to do, apparently. There are plenty of things that need doing. And I discovered very early on, if I'm willing to work in the world, there'll be something for me to do. It will be very disagreeable and low paid to start with, but the thing is, you can move up gradually. I did anyway, a little bit. But I found there was work to do, and when I couldn't get work, I volunteered, and I studied, and I found I I went out into the world, and I said, what jobs are there lots of vacancies in? What jobs is there a great need for people to do these things? And I fitted myself. I didn't say, what do I want? I said, what does the world want? And what can I do? What plays to my abilities? So I found something. I was kept very, very busy, but I had to do a couple of little things to assist the process of the removal of defects with beliefs. I had to choose new beliefs. And my new belief about my purpose in life is my purpose is to do God's revealed will, such as God's revealed will is. The Thomas Merton prayer, which I think was read at the beginning, uh, suggests that we might be wrong. The big book says we might be wrong, but if we believe it is God's will, we've tested it against spiritual principles, we've run it past a grown-up who won't co-sign our delusions, then one trusts that it's God's revealed will. My job is to do God's revealed will. And it needn't be impressive to the world. I needn't end up with a big life. I needn't look good to people I was at school with. None of that need be the case. But if I put one foot in front of another and do the things I'm asked to do by God, I trust that my purpose in life will thereby be fulfilled, and I might never see it. George Eliot in Middlemarch talks about this principle that the good of the world being largely dependent, or in great part dependent, on unhistoric acts, on people quietly getting on with their business, unnoticed and resting in unvisited tombs. So that's a new belief. I had to adopt that belief by saying, I'm choosing to believe that. That's where the choice is. Now, not much of a choice, because when the right belief is revealed, you have no choice anymore. But in a sense, it's a choice. With the thinking, I had to, as an act of the will. So adopting a new belief as an act of the will. With thinking, I had to adopt the position, I'm not going to permit fearful, fretting thinking. In the big book, have you ever heard someone say, I'm full of resentment? Like they're a pot and someone else has poured the resentment into them and filled up the pot. In the big book, it doesn't say that, anything like that. It says about resentment to the extent that we permit these. If I'm resentful, I'm permitting it. I'm not responsible for generating the impulse to resent someone, but if I resent someone, I've permitted it because I think it's a good idea. Otherwise, I wouldn't be permitting it. I have to choose and then exert my will to say, let's say with the worry, I'm not going to think about that. I'm going to think about something else. Doesn't matter what. Cherries, Egypt, your favorite anime series, the task at hand, your mother's birthday present. It doesn't matter. Anything but that temptation. And this is my little job. My little job is to look out for those temptations, to engage in those mental patterns and say no to myself. And with the behavior, I gave the example of the inappropriate sexual behavior, not inappropriate because it harms anyone else. I mean, that's also inappropriate, but that's a different category. Inappropriate in the sense of not spiritually right for me. Whatever modern society says, the notion that what is old-fashioned is bad and what is modern is good by virtue of them being old-fashioned and modern, I think I would take issue with that. My job is to say no to myself constantly. And that is the absolute surrender. It's no good saying yes to God and saying yes to self. You can end up frightfully muddled, flipping back and forth schizophrenically between the two gods, the real one and the fake one. So there's an awful lot of saying no. And sometimes I understand what people mean when they say this. They say it's hard. It's hard to say no to the old belief, the old thinking, the old behavior. It's not hard, it's unpleasant. And there's a difference. It is unpleasant to not do the thing you desperately want to do. It is unpleasant not to even think about the thing that everyone else is talking about. It's unpleasant. But this is what this absolute surrender is. It's saying, if I want a new life, I have to say absolutely no to the old one in order for the new one to be given to me. Each time I say no to a thought and redirect it back to the present, every time I say no to a particular behavior pattern and say, I'm not going to do that right now. I'm not going to do that today. I feel pain. It's only pain. I didn't know that pain was only pain. I thought pain was a problem. I thought pain was a crisis. I thought pain was a dime for a phone call. And it's not. It's just pain. And it passes if you let it. Because each moment has its own feeling if I let it. And I'd say to the pain, come at me, come on, absolute surrender to reality of what is going on inside me. Come at me, give me everything you've got. And it's got nothing. Nothing. Pain is fine. Suffering is all the beliefs that get built up about the pain. This will never end. I can't bear this is a judgment on the pain. It's my ego wanting me to surrender absolutely to it by telling me I can't do this. And I can. I'll tell you, I don't know about you and your drinking. I had to put up with a lot of pain and suffering in order to continue drinking. And by God, I was persistent with it. I don't have a problem with pain. I have a problem with the notion and the steps that I need to be gotten so completely out of the way. People talk about becoming the hole in the donut. I think it's true. I think that's what we have to become. This willingness to not think about oneself. And the funny thing is, there's a very curious thing in giving up myself completely. I feel more myself than I've ever felt in my life. In C.S. Lewis's Screwtape Letters, which are a work of fiction but purport to be letters written by a senior tempting devil, to a junior one about how he can best tempt his human prospect. He talks about what evil wants, what the devil wants is to feed on people. And there's nothing left. Someone that's totally eaten up by evil, there's nothing left. They're eaten alive. And he says a very curious thing that what God wants He wants you to abandon yourself completely, but with a different purpose, in order for you ultimately to become the person that you really are. So both are requiring destruction of self, but with completely different ends. And there's another very chilling moment in, I think, C.S. Lewis's The Great Divorce, where he talks about these sort of spirits beyond in this sort of fictitious depiction of what lies beyond the material realm. And he talks about a woman who in her life used to nag. And she started off as a woman who nagged, but eventually just became the nag. And the woman disappeared completely. That all that was left was the defect, and the person was just not even there. And it's chilling. And I felt that happening to me with character defects, that I start to become that very thing. And it's the horror of that, the horror of where that leads, if not drink, then other things as well. I didn't want that. So this utter surrender of self, it's there. One of the things that makes it terribly difficult is, I mean, I can see you live in all sorts of places. I live in a city uh, where lots of people have come here because wherever they grew up just wasn't good enough for them. The people there weren't good enough for them. So that's why they're here. There's a lot of ambition in this city, and there's a lot of hedonism. It's like the Saturday, and I live, ironically, right in the middle of Babylon, basically. Uh, it feels on a Saturday night and a Friday night. I mean, the UK is very drunken generally, but boy, is it bad around here. Um, it's a different path that is being offered. The spiritual path is a fundamentally different path. It's one where what I perceive around me in society, individualism, the hedonism, the materialism, all of those, I've tried them. I'm not a pious person. St. Augustine is very interesting to read because he tried everything before giving it up. He wasn't someone that went straight to God. He tried everything else. Manichaeism, Neoplatonism, lots and lots of sects, food, the pleasures of the world, the pleasures of society, ambition, success. He tried it all and it left him empty inside. Me too. So I'm coming from a position of having tried everything and failed. Um, I've had to give up that way of living. And I'll tell you a very curious thing. Now, I still live in the world. I have not one job, but two. One involves a lot of work just on my own, and the other one involves a lot of people. Uh, I interact with many hundreds of people in recovery every year. I go to lots of meetings. I'm involved in the organization of lots of meetings. I go to lots of different places, particularly countries where AA or other 12-step fellowships are in their relative infancy, and I share a lot of experience which I've had in service structures of various fellowships to help them set themselves up in a way which will hopefully enable those fellowships to thrive more effectively. I'm busy. I get a lot done. The three principles by which I live measure the effectiveness or the success of my management of my life under God's supervision and direction is effectiveness, efficiency, and harmony. And I get a lot done. It's done very efficiently, and by and large, it's done harmoniously. I have my moments, to say. But I did a little experiment, a thought experiment, where you don't try something so much as just think through what it would be like. And the thought experiment was this. if I suddenly get a few hours of release from work and other obligations, instinctively, what do I want to do? Not what do I feel I ought to do by way of obligation, but what do I want to do? And what I want to do is read spiritual books, I listen to a lot of spiritual writers and theological writers. I find theology fascinating, philosophy fascinating. I like to sit quietly and read prayers. I like prayer books because they help me connect with God. I want to spend time with God, and I can do that um, in religious places. I can do it in nature. I can do it through music, particularly through music. And this is the extraordinary thing that I've got, for I don't like saying get really, but there's no way around it. The things I've got from this absolute surrender, apart from the fact miraculously I seem to be sober and free of other addictions and free of entanglements as well. I'm not entangled with anyone. And given how many people in my life there are and how disordered we all are, that's quite a remarkable feat. But when I've got spare time, what I want is to be alone with God because it makes me happy. No, it doesn't make me happy. I find my happiness, which is there the whole time. I become aware of that happiness. Sometimes when I'm praying or sometimes when I'm reading a spiritual book, I stop so that I can simply be with God. Perfectly happy doing it. So I've got great hopes for what happens when I leave the material realm. One thing as well, which I think is worth mentioning, I think the phrase is a militant atheist. Those are the two words that go together. I was a militant atheist. And if you're an atheist, good luck to you. If you can make a good run of it, well, absolutely, my hat is off to you. But I was a vicious atheist with great contempt for people that believed in God. The experiences I've had over the last 30 years have made clear to me that my material life is simply a medium that I operate through. That I can't die when my physical body packs up. I'm perfectly comfortable with, there's a Jesuit, Paul Coutinho, Indian Jesuit, who said that material reality is about 1% of the whole of reality. And I read that 20 years ago. In the last few years, I've understood why he says that and understood it to be true. And I haven't got there through intellectual work. I've got there through the AA program. And that gift I wouldn't exchange for anything, certainly not a glass of gin. So with 2 seconds, thank you very much for listening.
Hey everybody, my name is Andy, blessed to be an alcoholic. Thank you, Tim, for a riveting share of the language of the heart with such honesty, insightfulness, passion, and gratitude. We're fortunate to have Tim here for 20 minutes to answer your burning, but perhaps smoldering questions focused on his talk today. Our guidelines for this Q&A are as follows, as Kira said. In 1 minute or less, please share a quick thank you and or a question. I'm going to apologize in advance that I will gently interrupt you with love if you are going longer than 60 seconds. So let's be crisp and to the point, please, as brevity is not a character defect. So get your virtual hands up, please. Who would like to kick us off? All right. I see Michael. Michael, come on in.
Hi, thank you. Tim, I just wanted to comment on how much I appreciated your share and the fact that you draw out the fine points of difference that spell out the actual difference between recovery and sobriety and the difference between sobriety and drunkenness in a way that makes even the most casual observer much more aware of what we're dealing with. Thank you kindly.
Hey, thank you, Michael. Do we have any hands, please, at this time? No? Okay. Then I will ask a question, and then hopefully we'll have some hands come up as soon as possible. So Tim, my question for you is, I had it written here, but I have so many notes here that it's all scribbled. So I know. The question of surrender versus volunteering. Would you say that volunteering now happens more for you than the act of surrender or the state of surrender?
Can you tell me what you mean by volunteering?
Well, the idea that there's no resistance. Basically, your nature now is to be there, to volunteer, let's say, to a moment in life in which you think that God has a plan for you in that moment, where it's not so, the act of surrender which got us here, which got me here, it's more of being in a state of surrender, to any given moment. So I kind of call it volunteerism. Does that make sense?
Very good. I think I've understood. Yeah. So I think I would draw a distinction between the principle of surrender and then the follow through. So the principle of surrender, it's a decision that I made as an act of the will to say, God, you are in charge. I hereby undertake to consult you, to act in a moral way, to act in the interests, act for the good of all, to get up every day, page 86 of the big book, ask God, what do you want me to do? Now, of course, one falls asleep and then one jolts awake again. But I think in a sense that the surrender is almost a one-off when I'm taking step 3. It's reaffirmed in step 7, a little bit like, it's not a religious program, but if people are familiar with the notion of baptism and confirmation, it's not far off. With baptism, you're not given a lot of choice in the matter, whereas confirmation, or maybe you don't have much choice with confirmation, but you're encouraged to think about it a little bit before you actually do it. You've got a little bit of history behind you, even as a teenager, a little bit of awareness. So surrender is something I do, but I must then follow it through. Surrender is often done, in my experience, in a moment of absolute desperation. But then the feeling passes and you're left with the contract you've signed. And I like the image in the big book of the employer, because pretty much everyone's got experience of what that means. You show up at work and you say, what do you want me to do? And they tell you, and then you do it. At least in most workplaces. I think there might be dysfunctional ones where things work differently, but in a good workplace, you just do as you're told. And if you're asked your view on something, well, you can give it, but if you're not, don't volunteer it. and it's on their head. So with this sort of volunteering thing, to volunteer implies I'm going above and beyond in some way, that I'm sitting here doing what I'm doing, and I notice an opportunity over there. I don't think it's about that. I think it's about saying to God each day, what do you want me to do? And then getting on with it. And frankly, there's very little choice. I have a home, a marriage, I have a couple of jobs, I have sponsees, I have service. That takes care of about 98% of the decision making. There's not a lot left over after that. So that's my answer. Back to you.
Oh, wonderful, Tim. Thank you for shedding some light on that. Appreciate it. All right, why don't we go to Australia? Janet, come on in.
Hi, Tim. Thank you so much. I just have a question about step 6, just something that you commented on. So when I first got sober, it was incomprehensible to even understand who I was, how I was. I did the inventory and I was guided to look at behaviors that were opposite to the behaviors that were going on. But it's, more now challenged where people say, is that a self-determined objective? So like you mentioned jealousy, like I was plagued with jealousy, and that's completely been removed. But what I found helpful was to look at behaviors that were the opposite to being jealous. But I suppose, does that imply then that I still have power to create change? I've definitely changed, but it's just when guiding new people now, I found that really helpful in early recovery. Now I've got no idea if I'm going to be different, what it's going to look like, and I go to God. I just wondered if you had any comments on that. Thanks.
Yeah, I think that's very good. I think there are several questions in there, so I'm going to try and look at this systematically. With almost every defect, the opposing virtue is self-evident. If one's sexual behavior has been loose, then the one in the S fellowship, they talk about the bottom lines of what one decides would be sane behavior. In the big book, it asks us to construct, under God's supervision, with God's guidance, a sane and sound ideal. So it's not self-determined, it's God-determined. What do you want me to do instead? In step 11, in the 12 and 12, it talks about if you want to build a house, you have to envision it first. And step 11 is part of the process of envisioning that. In concept 9, Bill Wilson talks about vision being an important feature of leadership in a way, where you have to envision how things could be different. You have to work through all the possibilities. It is under God's direction. If it's done with good intentions, it's under God's direction. It stacks up with spiritual principles. You run it past sensible people, and they give the green light on the sane and sound ideal for the alternative behavior. Then I don't think there's any risk that it's self-will. There isn't a major risk that it's self-will. Now, will has got a sort of bad name in AA. Surrender doesn't mean then sitting for the rest of your life like a lobster bisque and waiting to be eaten. One's given a lot of energy and one must use the energy. The point is, where is it going to be directed? And doing God's will takes an awful lot of courage and grit and determination. It's much easier to sit back, give up, and get everyone else to do the work for you. But that's not, I don't think that's what I'm asked to do by the higher power. So that the problem is not the presence or the absence of will. The problem is confused will or misdirected will. And what the program's enabled me to do is direct the will towards a small number of very clear, very definite goals. So with 6 and 7, the question of what is God's job and what is my job? Anything that is within my power to do is my job to do. That's why it's in my power to do it. Sometimes people say, well, there's no point in praying to God, for instance, because God already knows what is supposed to happen. God's will be done anyway. But it's a little bit like saying, well, if it's raining, or at risk of raining, I shan't take an umbrella because if God wants me to be dry, He will stop the rain for me. If God wanted me to not starve, then food would appear on my table. It's folly. One of the ways in which it appears to me, at any rate, that God's will is done is by inspiring me directly to take the right action. And prayer seems to be another method. I'm absolutely certain that prayer brings about change. So there is a job for me to do, and one of those jobs is prayer. One of those jobs is to act on the results of prayer. But to flesh out the point about what God's job is in the removal of defects, my bit is to practice the last 5 steps, and particularly 8 and 9 involves envisioning how to operate differently in each area of one's life. That's what the long period of reconstruction ahead means on page 83. And throughout the rest of the book, it talks about solidly working using spiritual principles to rebuild lives. So that's part of 8 and 9. And then to live daily in 10, 11, and 12. So my job is to be an adequate custodian of my beliefs, my thinking, my behavior. Now, where does God come in? It's very difficult to describe this, but I'm going to have a go. A chap, his car breaks down, and he's with a very religious person, and the religious person says, I think we should pray. And the bloke says, I think we need to push the car. So they decide to pray and then to push the car. And they push the car and it starts again. And then they're motoring. And the chap says to his religious friend, he says, well, you see, no good praying. I was right. We were supposed to push the car. We did, and it started again. We pushed. That's what got the car started. And the chap says to him, we pushed, but God pulled. Now, it's a silly little story, but the point is, when I do my part by being an adequate custodian of the contents of my mind and my actions, I look back days, weeks, months, years later, and I think, I'm not like I was. The person is the same, but the way of thinking, the way of believing, the way of acting, these have fundamentally changed. The impulse to do certain things goes away. That's the extraordinary thing. The impulse goes. And it's as though my job, when removing rubbish from the house, is to put it outside my front door. It's not inside anymore, it's outside. And then the bin men come and take it away once a week. And it's like that with defects. I have to get them outside the house, but then God takes them away. I think that's the difference. I don't know if that makes any sense, but back to the host.
Oh, thank you so much, Janet, for that question, and Tim for that wonderful answer. So next up, Tim, we have a question from the chat. All right. If I have a sponsee who's feeling or acting dug in or stubborn or anti-surrender, so to speak, what might you suggest? Just tell them to take action, ignore their feelings, or question?
Just FYI, everyone, I'm not easy to have as a sponsor because I've had conversations with people where someone phones up with a problem and I say X, Y, and Z, and they start to argue with me or disagree or something. I said, well, I don't have anything else to say. Let's talk another time. I won't even engage it. So, I mean, sometimes things do merit discussion, but when there's real resistance, I can't do anything about someone else's resistance. I have enough trouble with my own. I can't deal with someone else's. I'm not there to. There used to be an off license, so if you're Australian, a bottle shop, and if you're American, wherever you buy alcohol in America, called Threshers. And my friend Midge, if someone was at the Friday meeting we used to go to years ago, if someone was complaining or resisting the program, so will someone just buy them some Threshers vouchers? Just go and have a drink. If you don't like, no one has to be in AA. You really don't. There are secular organizations. There are all sorts of organizations which help people, but most local authorities in at least communist countries like the United Kingdom, we've got lots of agencies there to help, funded by the public purse. You have to pay a thing. It's marvelous. You don't have to be here, and you don't have to be sponsored. If you don't like it, don't be sponsored. The perverse thing, like I say this as someone who's been very perverse in this matter, is to come into AA, then complain about how it is, to go to a meeting, complain about how it is, to ask someone to sponsor you, and then you tell everyone what a wicked person they are, and try to pull them down in front of everyone to show them what for. Why bother? Just go and do something you want to do. Much, much easier. And if you get bored of that, you can come back. There we go.
Thank you for the question, and Tim, thank you for that answer. Tim, a question for you. We have one more question left. Do you have time to answer it? As beautiful. All right. SJ, also known as Sarah Jane, come on in.
Hi, thanks. Hi, Tim. Thank you. My name's SJ. I'm an alcoholic. And thanks for taking the meeting. Yes, I'm quite new in. I'm only day 31 today. I was making lots of notes about what you were saying, and I just quickly, when you were talking about moral inventory, I mean, obviously I haven't even started working the steps yet, and I was wondering, I will get to the actual question. Firstly, I was wondering, well, how do I find out what my defects are? Obviously, I've probably got loads. Is it obvious to the sponsor? And, you know, were you clueless before? Because I loved it when you went through your defects. I know one of my main ones is jealousy, and that's not to do with relationships. It's more to do with like careers and stuff. And then you talked about faulty belief. And, you know, I really do believe, I made a note when you said, you know, when you started out, you thought the purpose of your life relies on having a successful career. And I'm really in that at the moment. I'm thinking, I lost my house and my career and my car and everything else through drinking. Okay, I'm only 31 days in, but I'm like, I need to get that car, that house, that job back on track again, because only then will I feel complete enough, not so much for myself, but like you said, either the people you've been to school with, your contemporaries in the similar industry, or people that you might bump into when you go home to see your parents, so you can say, oh yes, this is what I do for a living, and this is what I am, just to sort of feel complete. How do you get away from that? Because and I know that is wrong thinking, but how do I change that? Because that's all I can still think about.
Good. We've got 2 minutes. I'm gonna actually 1 minute, because we'll need a minute to close up, but I can answer both those questions. To answer the first question, if you do the inventories as set out in the big book, with a sponsor who uses the big book, it will make everything clear. You don't need to get clever and name things. If you can name things with words like conceit or vanity or whatever, and arrogance, well, that's very nice. But as long as you just tell the truth about what your beliefs are, how you think, and what you've done, the facts speak for themselves. And on the other point, the way I've changed my beliefs is to first of all become present to how much suffering they cause. That's all. Awareness. Draw the line between the belief and the suffering that it causes, and then you say, why am I bothering? Why bother? There we go.
All right. Well, thank you, SJ, for the question, Tim, for the answer. This brings us nicely to the end of the Q&A. Really appreciate this, Tim. And back to you, Kira.